we have Professor Richard Wong, who is, of course, our provost and a political economist extraordinaire. He doesn't really need any introduction. So without going any further and read off his very long biography, I shall now ask Richard to take us through his 25 minute talk, and then hopefully leaving a few minutes for some Q&A. So over to you, Richard, please.
Well, thank you, Gabriel. I'll be relatively short in my presentation and hope we have more discussion later on. The coronavirus, COVID-19's impact on the economy is my main focus. And let me start with analyzing what is the nature of its effect on the economy. I'd like to walk people through a little bit without any PowerPoints or presentations. It's really a race between the shock to the supply side and the shock to the demand side. At the very beginning of the impact, it looked like it was primarily a supply shock. There was disruption in how people can get to work because of social distancing, because of quarantine. And as a result, it disrupted supply chains, in particular global supply chains. And one can think of it as a reduction in the supply of most goods and services. Secondly, this is actually rather different from, say, the recession in 2008, where it originated as a supply shock from the banking and financial sector. It is also different from most natural disasters or calamities, which the supply shock was a destruction of infrastructure, hardware, and maybe even to workers. Once you had this disruption on the supply side, there will be a feedback loop onto the demand side. Since workers would stop working, so economic production, jobs, they were working either fewer hours, or some of them might even lose their jobs and become unemployed, and businesses were slowing or even closing. As a result, incomes fall for a significant proportion of the working population. And therefore, people will begin to lower consumption, and therefore it decreases the total demand for goods. So the reduction in supply now feeds back into a reduction in demand. The demand, therefore, has further consequences. First, there is uncertainty about the progress of the disease. There's uncertainty about the economic policies that will be required to alleviate hardship, economic disruption to business, to jobs. And particularly, non-permanent transitory workers will begin to lose their income, particularly in affected industries like hotels, travel-related industries, tourist-related industries, and so forth. As a result of this uncertainty about the future and also the loss of income immediately, people will begin to save, right? They want to take precautions against the future, so that too reduces consumption, reduces spending. And firms will be worried about what and when it will happen, and therefore they will also lower investment, sometimes even totally halting all forms of investment. And of course, for people for firms that depend a lot on cash flow, there's also what economists call a liquidity issue. You could not balance revenue and expenditure streams. So the COVID-19 virus is not just a big shock to real economic variables like supply and demand. It is a shock also to how markets can adjust. It introduces what you would call a more friction between demand and supply with a strong feedback loops into the real economy. So shocks, contraction in supply leads to contraction in demand, which leads to further contraction in supply. And then, as you can see, the loops keeps going on. And in the process, economic value is lost. And that translates to lower levels of output. In particular, firms, especially those that are very dependent on cash flows to stay in business, this lack of demand and also disruptions to supply will become self-fulfilling and further lower demand so that some could become bankrupt, insolvent. Demand and supply loop similarly could lead to a financial crisis through uncertainty about the disease, and this will take some time to work it ourselves out. That's why around the world, in many economies, central banks have rushed into the scene to supply liquidity on a very large scale. This is basically to avoid firms from becoming insolvent, bankrupt, in order to save the prospect that when the economy can come back up after the epidemic, it can be controlled, that there are still firms that can survive and quickly come back into business. So that's what the monetary side, some of the governments have been trying to prevent. Right? So you see a lot of central banks injecting liquidity into the economic system at scales that is unprecedented in historical terms. But that only saves the operation of the firms. A lot of workers out of a job, some would reduce income, and especially in those countries where savings are low and people don't have a lot of savings they can draw on to keep functioning and operating, then the government has to adopt fiscal measures in terms of providing income support to particularly those segments of the population that are being hurt strongly. And that's why you also see government injecting money to income, to subsidies, to individual households, why taxes have been also temporarily forgiven, allow them to delay payments. All these are both fiscal measures that aim at supporting workers and some of it at supporting firms. Now, most economists around the world have become more worried about the demand shock than the supply shock in this instance, right? Because there are monetary measures to keep firms afloat, but the impact, particularly in many rich countries where savings rates are low, the demand shock is particularly severe. Because if you do not have a lot of savings, a decline in income has a big impact on decline in consumption, which is a very serious concern, not only for welfare, but also for sustaining spending, right? Now, the global supply chain disruptions is that there might be some reconfiguring in the process for a variety of different reasons, geopolitical as well as economic reasons. But it is difficult to reconfigure supply chains quickly and very difficult to reconfigure supply chains at short notice on such a massive scale. So that is why the disruption to supply chains, whereas it is severe, is not likely to alter to be done very quickly, and that's why the concern is somewhat less than the negative shock to demand. Returning to Hong Kong, the unique situation about Hong Kong is because we are on the linked exchange rate. As a result, we have no monetary policy, right? The good thing is because of our link to the US dollar and the whole world's interest rate are coming down, so it provides lower cost for borrowing, but we have no particular capacity to operate an independent monetary policy like other jurisdictions. So the only measure we have is a fiscal policy measure. Now, if the disruption is extensive, fortunately, Hong Kong is not. Our virus infection is not as severe as most other parts, at least up to this point. The fiscal measures that needs to be taken is still relatively less challenging. We have a considerable accumulated fiscal surplus, so the long run damage to the future is less compared to, say, other countries which will have to run up a much higher public debt. The other side is that, but on the other hand, Hong Kong's economy is very internationally open. So it would be very difficult for Hong Kong to get out of this economic recession without the whole world recovering. And so from a policy point of view, if we only rely on fiscal policy, we cannot alter our external demand very much. Then there's an important issue of how we can boost our domestic demand, domestic consumption demand. Well, there are solutions. Some of it is we've injected, maybe as much as $200 billion over two policy measures that were taken by government, and we potentially are able to inject more funding if the global economy does not recover. In fact, Hong Kong is quite blessed with other policy measures that we could adopt. We have our population live in government housing that are rented, and some of them are home ownership schemes. If we were to capitalize those housing by changing them from rental to ownership, we could potentially create wealth to the scale of $4 trillion, which is much larger than that's almost, nearly twice GDP. So our ability to increase domestic consumption demand and even investment demand without relying on the international recovery from the international demand, from external demand, is actually quite abundant in terms of our ability to do so. It's a matter of whether we will be willing to adopt those policies. So if we were to adopt a variety of different policies, I think Hong Kong's economy can survive and maybe even thrive through this economic recession created by the epidemic, the pandemic. So that's basically what I would like to share with everyone about my thoughts about the economic challenges that we face. It is severe. It relies on resumption of domestic demand, but with social distancing necessary for some period of time. We still have other options. We do not have monetary options. We have some fiscal options, and we have a considerable lever in terms of privatizing public housing that could boost wealth and therefore consumption demand to tie us through until we wait for the either the vaccine, the cure, the pharmacological cure, and the economy, the global economy recovers. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Richard. You have lit an absolute forest fire of questions here. So perhaps over the next 10 minutes, let's go and take each of them one by one. So there is this question from Harry Ho asking you, to what extent is Hong Kong's economy insulated from or integrated with the US economy? And how might this affect Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong's economy is wide open. We are deeply integrated through economic relationships with the whole world, with the US, with Europe, with the mainland, and since everyone is impacted, and until all our major investment and trading partners recover, we will always be performing at subpar, right? There's no way we could lift ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? I did outline some possibility where we could lift ourselves up by our bootstraps in terms of increasing domestic spending, right?
Right. Now, so I'm just going chronologically to the time that people put in question. So the next question is from Malik Perez. So he asked, for the 1918 influenza pandemic, 100 years ago, are you aware of any data on differences in economic recovery between different cities in the US or anywhere else in the world who opened up the economy rapidly versus those who were more cautious in opening up after the lockdown?
You mean 100 years? No, I'm not aware. I'm actually pretty ignorant about what happened during that period of time. But generally, as long, the key thing is for economic recovery in all epidemics is that is to stop the epidemic, right? I mean, you got to deal with the biological, pharmacological side, the health side first, because otherwise it's not. Now, different epidemics impact the economy in different ways, right? This one is quite severe because because until the cure is found, the vaccine is found, it's basically stop interacting, stop human interaction. And if you stop human interaction, you are also slowing down economic interaction. And this is and can it recover very quickly? The answer has to be yes, because if not a lot of people die, the human capital is is intact. The virus does not destroy physical capital. It does not destroy infrastructure. It may even stimulate investment in certain types of infrastructure this time, which is because it is digital. We have a different digital infrastructure, which does not infect. So I would think, yes, once you can control the pandemic, I think the economy will rebound very quickly.
All right, next question. Very quickly, Gina Machetti asks, what role do you see the humanities and the arts in this conversation about COVID?
I can imagine a couple. Very practically, since we have to maintain social distancing, this puts a huge psychological pressure on human beings, which are a social animal. So spiritual life, communal life needs to be enriched in some form, and I think the humanities would be important. There's a lot of reflection about this. I think it's probably a lot of and reflecting on the significance for human human society, where I think there are a lot of issues. The connectivity we have now is so global, and the impact can emerge in such a short period of time. I think we are living in a very connected world. So I think this will be one of those important areas that old ideologies in this new environment needs to be rethought. And I think all our colleagues in humanities and social sciences can has a field day, right, in terms of exploring all these issues.
Right. A question from Margaret Burnett, basically on your thoughts about reconfiguring supply chains away from the horizontal, which appears to be more susceptible to the many faceted disruptions you talked about, and then moving it towards a vertical integration in a more localized or regional manner. So from a sustainability perspective, this may support mitigation by removing global interdependencies, and then allowing or even encouraging local communities to diversify and regain local ownership and resilience. What are your thoughts?
I think on certain supplies of products, maybe even some services that are essential to the first line defense of any future epidemic, is certainly the healthcare and hospital medical sector. That certainly, I think, first of all, attempts to ensure that these services, protective gear and all this, some form of reasonable regional, local, or even national self-sufficiency probably will definitely emerge. I think there's no question about that. Beyond this, it's difficult to conclude that therefore you want to go to self-sufficiency. We'll probably invest a lot more in AI, robots, digital technology, which will make us much more integrated, not less integrated. We may wish to diversify our supply chains, but to where? Maybe, is this safer to concentrate it, or is this safer to diversify it even more? That is not known. It will depend on various sectors. As it just so happened, the 30 years of globalization in the past has created a lot of manufacturing capacity, say, in the mainland. Maybe you want to diversify it more. That means diversifying away from the mainland, but that does not mean it becomes less globally connected. It's just that it's less concentrated in one country rather than in fact, it could become diversified into a wider range of countries. So I would not conclude it will lead to less globalization. I think it will vary by sector, and I think geographically, I would even think it will become more diversified.
Right. Next question from Terence G. Professor Wong, what are your forecasts for unemployment and GDP for Hong Kong this and next year? I don't do forecasting very much. I do have a research associate that does that, and the forecast, and we do a very short-term forecast. And the forecast for unemployment rate in Hong Kong probably will reach 5% fairly soon within this year. Will it go more than that? Well, it depends on what you do. Our external demand means forecasting what happens to the rest of the world. It's too early to do such forecast. At this time, it's not meaningful to do this forecasting because the epidemic is still ongoing, and it's not clear whether there will be other ways and how significant are those ways. And if all those things were to return
the forecast would be pretty pessimistic.
Right. There are many, many more questions, but perhaps we can do this in the brainstorming session, because most of these I recognize as colleagues actually in the university. But let us just allow one of our RPGs, actually a UGC Hong Kong PF RPG, Jason Yin, to ask the last question. He said, global crises have highlighted shortcomings in the financial sector and has led to financial reforms. Should we be expecting major financial reforms when we come out of this COVID crisis, or is the financial sector seeing this as more of a one-off and therefore will not lead to systemic change?
Well, I think it is inevitable. The financial sector will have a lot of challenges going forward, largely because during this period, we will have most of the advanced economies will run up a huge public debt and a hugely expanded monetary balance sheet. Now, adjusting through this process needs a variety of prudent measures to return back to normalcy. Now, we haven't even returned back to normalcy as a result of the 2008 financial crisis and economic recession. This will add to it. So the changes and the adjustments to the financial sector has actually piled up even more. So yes, it will happen. The question is, there's a lot of procrastination in the world, right? So fixing a difficult problem takes a very long time.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Richard. Absolutely enlightening.